Good afternoon, everyone. This is meeting number 59 of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, Wednesday, May 17th, 2017. I remind everyone that we are televised today and that we should mute our communications devices so they do not interfere with our meeting. I will also mention that because we have been interrupted with 2 votes already, we are approximately 45 minutes behind here, and so we're going to adjust somewhat the time periods in the questioning, just cut back so everyone will still get a chance, and we can perhaps see what happens at quitting time too if we want to stretch it out a little longer, but we're scheduled to go till 5:30. Today we are beginning our consideration of the spring 2017 reports of the Auditor General of Canada. Our witnesses are from the Office of the Auditor General of Canada. We welcome Mr. Michael Ferguson, the Auditor General of Canada, and his team of professionals. We have with them here today Joanne Butler, the Principal, Richard Dominga, Principal, Andrew Hayes, Principal, Nicholas Swales, Principal, all part of his team, and are prepared to answer questions from our members. So I would invite the Auditor General at this time to proceed with an opening statement before we proceed to the rounds of questioning. Mr. Ferguson, please.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I'm pleased to present my spring 2017 reports, which were tabled in the House of Commons yesterday. I'm accompanied by Richard Domingue, Nicholas Swales, Joanne Butler, and Andrew Hayes. In the past, I have said that departments need to understand the way people interact with their programs as a way to improve their services to people. With this series of audits, I see a very clear theme that how government programs are described on paper is often different from how the departments put those programs into practice, and that matters to people. Let's start with our audit that focused on whether Finance Canada, Global Affairs Canada, and the Canada Border Services Agency carried out their roles to collect customs duties on the many goods imported into Canada each year. In 2015-16, federal government revenue from those duties was more than $5 billion. We found that the Canada Border Services Agency and Global Affairs Canada did not adequately control the entry of certain goods such as dairy products, chicken, beef, and eggs. As a result, some goods were imported without appropriate permits. Had they been properly controlled at the border, these goods would have been assessed $168 million in duties in 2015. We also examined the $20 minimum value for customs duties on imports by mail or courier. This amount has not changed since 1992, but the volume of incoming parcels has increased significantly. The agency did not have the staff to inspect them all. This means that duties were not assessed in all cases where they should have been. Overall, in our view, the way Canada assesses customs duties and controls goods coming into the country is complex and difficult to administer, which means there's a different system on paper than in practice. In another audit, we looked at what the Canada Border Services Agency and Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada did to manage the risk that their staff could be corrupted. We concluded that while the agency and the department recognized their employees could be vulnerable, they need to better train their staff and use the information they already have to identify potential inappropriate actions. For example, we were able to use the agency's information to estimate that over the course of a year, border services officers did not collect the information they were supposed to collect on the people who entered Canada in some 300,000 vehicles. We found that Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada appropriately processed visas at Canada's overseas missions. However, Global Affairs Canada should make sure that all locally hired staff have completed their mandatory ethics training. Passons maintenant au programme.
Let's turn now to the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, where there has been some progress, but where differences remain between what is done in practice and how the program is described on paper. This program is meant to help employees fill job vacancies when qualified Canadians are not available. Employment and Social Development Canada is supposed to make sure the program is used to respond only to real labor shortages. Overall, the reforms that the department introduced in 2014 have helped to reduce the number of temporary foreign workers needed in Canada. However, those reforms fell short of ensuring that employers only hired temporary and foreign workers as a last resort. In many cases, the department took the word of employers that they could not find Canadian staff. And again, the department did not use its own information, such as employment insurance data, to determine whether Canadians could fill these jobs. We saw indications that unemployed, experienced Canadians may have been able to work at fish plants, but temporary foreign workers were hired instead. Let's turn now to our audit of mental health support in the RCMP. In May 2014, the RCMP was one of the first federal organizations to roll out a mental health strategy. The strategy was meant to contribute to a psychologically healthy and safe workplace and to better support employees. We found that the RCMP's implementation of its strategy fell short of meeting members' mental health needs. The RCMP did not allocate enough resources to implement its strategy. 16% of members had to wait too long to access the service they needed. In a few cases, members waited more than 2 years. This strategy is important for the RCMP, for Canadians, and for the government as a whole, and it has to succeed. The RCMP has to fix the problems we identified and ensure the successful implementation of its mental health strategy. In another audit, we looked at civil aviation infrastructure in Canada's north. In the north, air travel is the only year-round way for many remote communities to connect to the rest of the country. In our view, Transport Canada was not actively engaged to deal with known infrastructure challenges at Canada's remote northern airports. Challenges include insufficient runway lighting and navigational aids. In the north, where landing and takeoff time is limited and restricted, such gaps can make a critical difference, for example, in a medical emergency. Let's turn now to our audit on the risk of fraud. We looked at how the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, Global Affairs Canada, Health Canada, Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada, and Public Services and Procurement Canada managed their risk of fraud. We saw good practices in each organization. Some conducted fraud risk assessments and properly justified their sole source contracts and contract amendments. However, no single organization covered all the basics of fraud risk. We are concerned that controls to manage the risk of internal fraud were not always implemented. For example, few employees had received mandatory training on values and ethics, and cases of potential conflict of interest took too long to resolve.
Our goal was to examine Canada's progress on its 2009 commitment to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. We found that Finance Canada still had not defined what an inefficient fossil fuel subsidy was, nor could the department tell us how many inefficient fossil fuel subsidies there could be. We asked Finance Canada to provide us with its analysis of the social, economic and environmental aspects of these subsidies. The department did not give us that information. Therefore, I cannot give Parliament or Canadians assurance about Finance Canada's work on this file. As a result of this, we provided with our spring reports a message from the Auditor General that describes the trouble we had accessing certain information we needed to complete our audits. Overall, I am very concerned that Finance Canada did not give us all the information we needed to do our work. Hopefully, the recently issued order in Council signals that the government is willing to work with us to ensure that we do not encounter similar problems in the future. Our spring reports to Parliament also include our audits on 3 Crown corporations, the Canadian Museum of Nature, Defence Construction Canada, and the Freshwater Fish Marketing Corporation. Overall, we found that both the Canadian Museum of Nature and Defence Construction Canada managed their operations well. In the case of Freshwater Fish Marketing Corporation, however, we found problems in board oversight, at the management level, and in day-to-day operations that were so extensive that the corporation is at high risk of not meeting its mandate. Fundamentally, we would expect a Crown corporation to do much better, and there is room for significant improvement at the Freshwater Fish Marketing Corporation.
Lastly, I am pleased to introduce a new product that we also released. It is not an audit, but rather a commentary on our audits of the financial statements of federal organizations. These audits account for almost half of our workload. Financial audits provide parliamentarians with information that is useful to oversee government organizations that spend taxpayer dollars to serve Canadians. The federal public sector produces hundreds of complex financial reports each year. We developed this new product to help parliamentarians understand and navigate the mass of financial information that is produced by individual organizations and by the government as a whole. To close, I would like to go back to the theme that weaves many of these audits together. Government departments must make sure that they implement their programs in the way that they were designed and communicated to Canadians. Programs will not produce the intended results if departments do not put into practice what they said they were going to deliver. Furthermore, we again see examples where departments did not use their own data to help them understand and improve their results. So, while many of the issues we have raised in these audits are concerning, I think many of them can be fixed, and that fixing them will lead to better results. Mr. Chair, that concludes my opening statement. I would be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Sir, and we want to thank your team as well for the report, the spring report. We'll move into the first round of questioning, and we're going to try to hold them to 5 minutes. And we'll go to Mr. Harvey, please, for the first 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you all for being here today, especially you, Mr. Ferguson. I just want to touch quickly on your audit on the temporary foreign worker program, just to get an idea, reading through the recommendations here and around the different interpretation of how the department's rolling out that program as opposed to what you feel the policy is. And I know, like in the past, I've been very critical of the program from the standpoint that, as somebody that's used the program and accessed the program in the past, you referenced the data from the geographical areas around unemployment levels and other labor force data, workforce data that's available. But I know from my own experience in the past, I have questioned sometimes that data and how it's relevant, how accurate it is in terms of the delivery of the program. Just because unemployment trends may signal one thing doesn't necessarily mean that all those people are as they are ready, willing, and able to go to work in any certain type of job. I just want to get your thoughts around what you feel the biggest challenges with that program are, and whether you feel it's part of it is a case where there's not enough ear to the ground as to what's going on in different jurisdictions, and whether or not the program would be better developed in the future as something that took into account more regional differences and differences between industries.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Certainly, we did say in the report, and I'm referring, for example, to paragraph 5.98, where we said that we found the department did not know whether the program was having unintended consequences, for example, such as suppressing wages, allowing businesses to rely on foreign workers instead of hiring Canadians, or discouraging capital investment and innovation. So that's one place where we said that the department needed to be doing a better job of actually understanding what the impact of the program was. We also identified that the department was not using all of the information that it had available, in order to assess whether there really were labor market shortages. We also did point out, and I think this is going to be something that will be interesting to keep an eye on in paragraph 5.59, that in 2014, the Department of Employment and Social Development and Statistics Canada started developing a survey to collect information on job vacancies and wages. The department expected the survey to provide it with information that it could use to assess labor markets when considering applications to the program. And they're spending quite a bit of money on this. At the time of the audit, it was estimated to be $14 million a year to identify that type of information. So hopefully they will be able to use that information to get a better sense of where there may be those labor market shortages.
Yeah, my comments, of course, are my own, and they're just reflective of the experience that I had within private industry and the processing industry with that program. But the company that I worked with previous, we had around 120 employees, of which 15 were temporary foreign workers. And the reason that we had 15 temporary foreign workers was because I had put out a call for 20 vacancies, and basically we followed the labor market impact assessment rules, but recognizing that we were doing that advertising not to access the program, but to actually get local labor. So at the end of our collection period, we actually had 157 resumes for 20 jobs, all within the catchment area. But when I called each one of those people to come for an interview, less than 50% of them were even willing to come for an interview. Because under the last round of changes that were done to the program, if they were within an hour's drive, they had to apply for the job regardless of whether they ever had the intention on filling it. But somebody's not going to travel for an hour for a $12 or $14 an hour job, which these happen to be. They were labor jobs in a production environment. So of that, I think it was 57 people that I called in for an interview that accepted and came in. Of that, we brought 17 back for a second interview with my superior, and we ended up hiring 5. And I filled the other 15 with temporary foreign workers because the labor pool there just wasn't there to support it. That's not to say that I didn't have, if I looked at just the raw data, it would have indicated that there was more than enough labor in the area to fill those vacancies. But the question is whether or not all of that, all of the people that qualified to do that job were willing to go do it.
Thank you, Mr. Harvey. I don't know if there's a comment there. It wasn't really a question, but a good observation. Yeah. We're over our time. We'll go to Mr. McColman, and we may be able to come back to that point as well. Mr. McColman.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Ferguson, for being here today, and for your staff and your work on these reports. I'd like to focus in on number 3, preventing corruption in immigration and border services, third chapter. And I'm just wondering, as you look through the report and the recommendations, whether, as well as these recommendations, is there any evidence, either anecdotally or found through the auditing process, of actual case examples of fraudulent behavior and or corruption in the Canada Border Services Agency and or the Immigration Department?
So in the course of the audit, we didn't identify any specific cases of corruption. We identified a number of instances where the controls were not applied the way that they should have been applied. Now, of course, I am aware of some situations that have been in the media over the last couple of months where there have been some accusations against Canada Border Services officers, not necessarily ones working at the border, but 2 of them were working at Pearson Airport. So there have been some of those cases reported in the media. We didn't identify in the course of the audit any specific instances of people, not following their controls because of corruption, but we did find instances where the controls weren't followed as they should have been.
Okay, and what would we expect the fraud and corruption to look like in these agencies? Well,
I guess at the end of the day, the type of thing that it could be is, if a member of one of these organizations was involved in corrupt activity, it could mean that they were aiding somebody to get either people or goods into the country that shouldn't be. So that type of thing.
Okay, I'd like to move on then to one of your special reports, and it's just let me get the one where you did a special examination of the Crown Corporation, the Freshwater Fish Marketing Corporation. Obviously, a pretty disturbing report to pretty much see everything falling apart at every level of that particular corporation. Is it a fair question to ask you whether or not this corporation, whatever the good intentions might have been when it was started, that an examination perhaps should occur of whether it's relevant today that this even, that the government even be in this business of freshwater fish marketing?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So obviously, whether this type of an organization should exist or not is a policy decision of the government. I think what we found, and I think as I said in my opening statement, we would certainly expect that a Crown Corporation operate much better than what Freshwater Fish was doing. Freshwater Fish was established in 1969. Since then, there have been a number of different changes to the environment that it works in. Changes in, who, in the past, it was able to buy all of the fish products that were produced in the Manitoba and Saskatchewan and Northwest Territories areas. Saskatchewan is no longer a part of that, so now they have to have specific agreements with fishers, and Manitoba has signaled its intent to withdraw as well. So their working environment is very different. So I think sort of a consideration of the environment that the corporation works in is something that should be done. And in fact, part of the problem that we found in that special examination was the corporation hadn't updated its strategic plan since I think it was 2011. They hadn't updated their risks since I believe it was 2014. So just from the organization point of view, they weren't doing enough to understand the changes in the environment that they were working in or the risks that they were facing. So I think some sort of an assessment of the environment the organization is working in would certainly be something that should be done.
Thank you very much. We'll now move to Mr. Christofferson.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much, Auditor General and your team. I'd like to focus, Chair, if I may, on your special message to us. This doesn't happen very often, thank goodness. I've only seen it once or twice in my 13 years, I get 12, 13 years on here. And I want to just set it up by reading your opening paragraph. And keep in mind that this is the process by which the Auditor General brings problems. If there's problems at all in terms of his work, this is how it's done. It's a message to us, and then it's in our lap. The opening paragraph of this message, Chair, is, quote, "I have prepared this message to inform the House of Commons, as subsection 7.1b of the Auditor General Act instructs me to do, that we did not receive all the information we needed for 2 of the audits we presented as part of the spring 2017 reports of the Auditor General to the Parliament of Canada." Further on, in both, quoting, "In both cases, Finance Canada confirmed the existence of the information we requested. However, as the department considered this information to be confidential to Cabinet, it determined that it could not provide the information to our auditors." Now, we understand clearly that there are certain things that are exempt from your reach, and that's Cabinet confidentiality, where there's advice to ministers, recommendations to the government, and anything pertaining to the debate that takes place. That's confidential, and it should remain so. All the information, however, analysis, reports, any kind of submissions that feed into that recommendation, they're all fair game because they're just analysis. And oftentimes what the Auditor General needs to do is to confirm that it was done, which is the case here, actually. Now, as I understand this, and it gets a little bit complicated, but as I understand it, you, Auditor General, were denied the information initially, and my words, the government, current government, was brought kicking and screaming to the point where they finally passed an order in council that released the information as far back as the beginning of this government. So, number one, a severe crack on the wrist for having to be forced to do what they should have done by law, but an acknowledgement that they did do the right thing at the end of the day and that the immediate problem is solved. However, we still have 2 problems as I see it, Chair. One is there's more information needed. By the way, this audit is not concluded. It remains unfinished business because the Auditor General cannot get the information. So the government, again, kicking and screaming, has brought us as far back as when they took power. But going back, we don't have that information, and apparently it's the clerk of the Privy Council or someone in a senior bureaucratic position who has the responsibility to protect the actual things that need to be kept confidential from previous governments. So we sorted it out with the current government, but not with the previous. And I know, well, I'll ask, I don't think yet you have a definitive legal answer for us, and we may end up, Chair, calling in the parliamentary law clerk, because as far as I'm concerned, the right of Parliament to demand papers, documents, and persons is absolute. And so it seems to me that if Parliament says, we want that document, that there's a way to get it, especially since it's not captured by cabinet confidentiality. I've got a minute left, thanks. So we need to find a way to force that document into the light of day as the law commands that it should, but we also need to be riding shotgun and putting pressure on the Privy Council to live up to their word, to not just do the Order in Council change. I don't have time to get into the details, but the other thing the Auditor General wants going forward is based on a first principles approach, so it's not every document listed as they come along, but rather a set of principles that says these type of documents you can access, and that'll remove a lot of this. So I didn't leave a lot of time, but just any thoughts you have on that, Auditor General, especially correcting me if I've got any of my understandings wrong.
Well, yeah, go ahead. I will give you extra time, but there won't be any more supplementary questions while he answers. Go ahead, sir.
You know, I mean, I think generally the way that you've characterized a lot of it, from a factual point of view at least, is right. What we now have is an order in council that would allow us to get access to the budget documents that we asked for after November 2015. But what we were looking for was analysis, and some of that analysis would have been done before November 2015. So, you know, that order in council, as you said, would not cover that. So even getting access to the analysis that was done after November 2015, which the Order in Council would give us the right to do, but which we have not yet, of course, asked for, so we haven't actually received any of that information. That wouldn't allow us to come back and tell you whether, you know, throughout the course of all of these tax measures, Finance Canada did all of the analysis that they should have done. So I think it's important to remember that. Certainly, you know, as I said in my opening statement, I consider that the most recent Order in Council to be a good step, and hopefully that shows the willingness on the part of the government to continue to work with us to find a lasting solution. But the Order in Council isn't sufficient. It isn't going to solve the problem long term, you know, because again, it's the same type of approach to fixing the problem as we've seen before, and those types of solutions tend to work for a while, but then another problem crops up. So we need to get to a better solution, and hopefully, you know, the Order in Council is a signal from the government that we will be able to work with them to get to that long-lasting solution.
Thank you very much, both for the question and the observation. I will now move to Mr. Lefebvre.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being with us today to talk about this very important report. In terms of Report 3 for immigration, and you did a sample over 12 months, and you said out of 19,300,000 entered Canada without inspection. Can you explain how you arrived at this figure? What type of inspection are we talking about here? I know when I go to the border, sometimes I get stopped. I have my passport, but I have a hard time understanding how can you come into Canada with a car without being inspected? And how did you get the sample? So I'll start, and then I'll ask my colleague, Mr. Swales, for a few more details, perhaps. In general, the first thing is that what we examined wasn't a sample in the beginning. We examined the information about the 19 million vehicles. And we identified problems in terms of the 500,000 cases. Of these 500,000 cases, we selected a sample. So first we looked at the entire population, and then for the sample, we were able to determine that the problem was with the 300,000 vehicles. But perhaps Mr. Swales could give us more details. So thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to clarify, the inspection process at the front line has two stages. the agent is supposed to ask you some questions, and then he's also supposed to take your documentation and to enter the information in a IT system. And the IT system, the computer, takes down every time this action is taken. And what we looked at is that every time a car came to the border, was there a trace of this in the system like it was supposed to be the case? And for our sample, even with the 500,000 cars, we did not see that all the necessary steps were taken in the IT system. Thank you very much. Your examination would be very interesting to pursue. I have a question about the civil aviation in the north of Canada. You looked at 117 airports? 117? 119 airports. No, 117 rather. At Exhibit 6.1 it says that there was 117 remote northern airports. Of these airports, how many were in communities that were majority of Indigenous communities? Most of these airports are located near Indigenous communities. I don't have the exact number, but it's the case for many of these airports. They're located near these Native communities. So these airports are entirely under the responsibility of Transport Canada? Yes. So once again, it would be interesting when we look at this to see how this is the case. Thank you very much.
Mr. Generou, please. 5.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Auditor, and your team for doing all this this great work for us and for Canadians. I do want to pick up on some of the line of questioning that my colleague, Mr. Harvey, had started along the temporary foreign worker program, particularly when it comes to unemployed skilled workers in my province of Alberta. Your findings were certainly a concern to me. I have it here, in fact, that you found 40% of the cases the program officers did not sufficiently question employers on whether they had made reasonable efforts to hire or train Canadians. So given that the temporary foreign worker program in 2015 hired 90,211 temporary foreign workers, are you, in your assessment, essentially saying that there's 36,084 jobs that were given to temporary foreign workers that could have gone to Canadians first?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The types of problems that we found tended to be more focused on certain types of industries. So we wouldn't be able to extrapolate exactly the way that you extrapolated that, because the problems we found tended to be clustered in certain types of industries, particularly the hiring of caregivers or the hiring of people in fish processing plants, those types of things. There would have been some other cases, but they would have been more on an individual point. So, you know, most of the issues tended to be clustered, so you couldn't just do a straight extrapolation of the 40%.
Then I guess, did you find clear examples of employers who are abusing the program, whether it be those industries or other?
Well, what we found were when you looked at the application that was presented by the potential employer, that in the application contained information that we felt the department should have questioned before they approved the hiring of a temporary foreign worker. You know, for example, we talk about the fact that there were people that were laid off, Canadians that were laid off from fish plants, and we looked at about 500 records of employment, so records of Canadians being laid off from fish plants, and the 80% of those had claimed EI during the period of time when those fish plants were hiring temporary foreign workers. So that should have been information that, you know, again, just an indication to the department that perhaps there were Canadians available, Canadians who had worked in that industry, Canadians who had experience in that industry, who were collecting employment insurance at the same time that temporary foreign workers were being hired. Similarly, we indicate, you know, a particular example that showed up in our sample of an employer who applied to hire a caregiver and said that they needed to hire a temporary foreign worker because they were looking for someone who was trustworthy and with the ability to work without supervision. But the department didn't question that application and say, well, you know, there would be Canadians available that would fit that description. So the issue that we had was that the department wasn't challenging some of the requests to make sure that there truly was a labour shortage and truly was, you know, there were no Canadians available to fill those jobs.
And to be clear, with the scope of your audit, did you speak to any employers throughout the audit directly?
I don't believe we spoke to any employers, but if I'm not right on that, I will provide a correction. I don't think we spoke directly to employers, but I'll check that.
Sure, and I have about 30 seconds left. Any examples similar to the caregivers, the fisheries, and a more regional breakdown, say perhaps within Alberta oil and gas sector, if you have any of those?
No, Mr. Chair, I don't have any of those examples.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Generu. We'll now move to Mr. Area, please. Mr. Area, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Ferguson. Mr. Christopherson made a very long statement. If I can recall it correctly, he did say that all the analysis, the reports which goes into preparation of documents that are covered under cabinet confidentiality is a fair game and it should be made accessible. Is that correct?
So our position is that according to the Auditor General Act, we have the right to access any information we need to do our work. That's clear in the Auditor General Act. We acknowledge we don't need access to the Cabinet confidence information, the discussions in Cabinets, the recommendations to Cabinet. We certainly feel our position is that any of the analysis that's been done by civil servants, that we should be getting access to that information.
Because I'm a bit confused, because you said in response to his question, what he mentioned is generally correct. So it seems to imply that any analysis reports that are being there, which went into making decisions for the cabinet, should be made available to you.
Yes, that's our position. Anything that was an analysis, you know, any reports that the department did leading up to the recommendations. We don't want to see the recommendations, but any of the analysis that they did, yes, we feel that we should be getting access to that, and we feel that our Act requires that we get access to that information.
And he also talked about the right of Parliament and seems to imply that the right of the Office of Auditor General is same as the right of Parliament. Is that correct?
So I can't comment on that. All I can comment on is that according to the Auditor General Act, we are supposed to be provided any information we need to do our job. If we are not given that, what we are to do is we are to report it to Parliament. Again, that's clear in the Auditor General Act. From there, it's in the hands of Parliament to do whatever Parliament can do with the issue. So I don't know, you know, all of the intricacies of the powers of Parliament in that instance. All I know is what our Act tells us that we have access to.
As I said, once again, my confusion came because you started your reply stating that what he mentioned is generally correct. It would be good if you can go through the statement, what Mr. Christopherson said, and your response to that, and if there's any ambiguity, to clear that at a later stage, not now.
So I can do that. You know, certainly what I was responding to was his description of the situation that we had, the fact that it was going before Parliament, Obviously, I don't know the details, so when I said generally correct, it was because I was trying to acknowledge that I didn't know the details of, what Parliament could do and that type of thing. But I'll go back through his statement, and if the committee wants me to provide clarification, I can do that.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Krishna. Going back to the custom duties, in para 8, you state that the way Canada assesses custom duties and controls coming into the country is complex and difficult to administer, which means there's a different system on paper than in practice. How prevalent it is and how much it will affect the collection of the appropriate duties?
Well, in the chapter, in the audit, we say that the Canada Border Service Agency themselves recognizes that, through work they've done over the years, that about 20% of the goods that come into the country are misclassified. Now, not every case of misclassification results in the wrong amount of duty being paid, because something could be misclassified, but what it should have been classified as would carry the same level of duty as the original classification. However, in the targeted investigations that the Canada Border Services Agency did over a certain period of time, they found $42 million worth of duties that should have been paid that were not paid, and they said that half of that was because of misclassification. So they know that 20% of goods coming across the border are misclassified. They know that when goods are misclassified, it does have an impact, a significant impact on revenue, but the agency themselves have not estimated what the total value of uncollected or unassessed customs duties might be because of those misclassifications. So, and then we had a number of different other areas within the customs duties program that were difficult for them to administer. But again, overall, the agency doesn't have an estimate on the total amount that those might be worth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Area and Mr. Ferguson. We'll now go to Mr. Christofferson, please. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Appreciate that. And if I just can, I mean, if my friend Mr. Area wants to get into the weeds on this, we can. The fact is that what made this particular situation different, I'm not letting go. I'm not letting go. What made this particularly different is that the analysis that would normally be available as a standalone document that could readily be accessed was this time included within a cabinet submission, and as a rule, that would be part of the recommendation, and that would be off-site. So we had this overlap of, well, I'm entitled, the Auditor General is entitled to get at it, but it's contained within a document labeled such that otherwise they couldn't. So it's taken all this time for Sunny Ways to suddenly realize that you cannot just stand on this technicality, that analysis needs to come up, or an admission that the analysis wasn't done. But I'm more than willing to get into, and we will be getting into the detailed weeds on this, because I do believe that we're ultimately going to have to bring in, I could be wrong, but my experience tells me we're going to need to bring in the parliamentary law clerk. The Auditor General right now cannot tell us with any certainty whether or not we have the power, and if we do, how do we go about exercising it to get information that goes before the mandate of the current government? Well, I think I'd be surprised if there's anybody on this committee that's going to take the position, well, it's not that important that the Auditor General get everything. As long as he gets, most of it, it'll sort of be okay. That's not the way we do things around here. And so we'll bring in, I would think, the parliamentary law clerk who will, and I would hope that in public, as a bit of a service, that we would have as much of that discussion public so that people can also watch and learn as we talk about how the law works. And then it would be my suggestion we'd move into camera and then take the instant case, and then we would get legal advice, which would be properly in camera in terms of actions that we may or may not want to take or to make to Parliament, which is the ultimate reservoir of all this power. So, having said that, I would like, though, to make sure that we don't leave here today, Chair, without putting a special focus on the RCMP and the mental health issues. And I don't think we've had a chance to turn our mind to that yet, and we should. It's going to be one of the things that we look at very, very carefully as a group, and I don't think I'm speaking out of school when I say it's unanimous slam dunk that we're doing a hearing on this one. But as we, or at least as I understand it so far, Auditor General, they were the first to come out with some of these measures, and that makes it extremely important for the rest of government that if this is the lead one, it needs to work, that the plan was there, but the failure is in the implementation of the plan. And you made reference to it in your opening remarks, but I'd like you to return to it and just put a focus on the key issues you think that we need to drill down on in terms of what has gone wrong with mental health services for our RCMP officers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll just give a brief introduction and then I'll ask Ms. Butler to perhaps provide some more details on it. But certainly, yes, the RCMP were one of the first federal organizations to put in place a mental health strategy. And I think as a sign not just to the members of the RCMP, but as a sign to the whole federal public service that these types of things, when they are put in place, they are going to work when people need them. I think it is absolutely critical that this strategy succeed, not just as a strategy on paper, but a strategy that is implemented the way that it is intended to be implemented. But I'll ask Ms. Butler if she wants to provide any details about sort of what she considers some of the most important components.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So overall, what we found, I think that the key problems to the implementation of this plan was first and foremost the fact that they developed a strategy, but they didn't put into practice or develop, okay, well, what is this going to cost? How exactly are we going to do it? And how will we make sure that it's getting done? So in other words, I know we'll use performance audit speak, but they needed a performance measurement framework in order to know that the strategy was being implemented as intended and that it was working, or if it wasn't, they could course correct it accordingly. And I will add that in the strategy, they made an explicit commitment that that was one of their goals, was to put in place a performance measurement framework, and unfortunately that hasn't yet come to pass. So I think those are, from a management perspective, those are sort of the very first things is how are we going to, what's our business plan and how are we going to monitor to make sure it's working? Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
If we put that aside, the other challenges that we found is that there are challenges across divisions in terms of consistency around the policies to support members' mental health. And this is particularly important for us to understand because, as you know, with the RCMP, members can be transferred from division to division. And it's really important that they understand they're going to have consistency of support because the lack of support obviously can have an impact on their career outcomes. So that's also something that we found was problematic.
I will now move to Ms. Shanahan. Ms. Shanahan, we're going to have you for 5 minutes there, and
very good.
Proceed.
Thank you, Chair. And actually, I'd like to thank you very much to the Auditor General and for his team for being with us here today. This is becoming quickly one of the highlights of my parliamentary career is attending these sessions and seeing the kind of work that the Auditor General's office is doing and trying to suss out really where our priorities should be as parliamentarians. And I've spoken about this before, and maybe it's just on my own, but I certainly, when I look at the reports that are before us, issues of security and safety are sort of the priority filters that I use as a first look through health. And access to health services, and then, of course, the money question. So in that regard, yes, report number 4, the mental health support for members of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police is certainly important to me. One thing that we see, and now we're understanding more, too, about how the audit reports look, is that in the about the audit section, page 29 of the report, there's a comment there that I would like the Auditor General or Ms. Butler to address, having to do with the members of the management not agreeing with the statistical collection methods. Here, I can find it directly if you don't have it. 4. About the audit, that's right. Which, from my understanding, is something fairly unusual to have.
So I have it in front of
Yeah,
okay.
RCMP management refused to confirm that the findings in this report are factually based because of disagreement about the approach used to report statistics from the file review and member survey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, I'll ask Ms. Butler for any details that need to be supplied. But this is a normal part of the practice that we go through when we do one of our audits, is that we ask the organizations to confirm that they agree that we have stated things factually correct. You know, again, we don't ask them to necessarily say that they agree with our opinion on something or our conclusion necessarily, but they should be agreeing with the facts. Now, in this case, it's interesting because the RCMP has agreed with all of our recommendations. So they have agreed that at the end we have come up with the right recommendations. They did not agree with how we reported some of the statistics, and perhaps I'll ask Ms. Butler to provide more detail.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So once again, there was overall agreement. The source of disagreement was with respect to, if you go to paragraph 461 on page 13 of the report, where we talk about the results of the case file review, and in particular when we get to the statistics of the 20% of members who remained on off-duty sick, in other words, never returned to work or took a discharge. The RCMP's disagreement was that they believe that, well, if those 20% never returned to work, that the other 80% did return to work in some capacity eventually, therefore we should be reporting it as an 80% success rate. We did not agree. We explained, as we do in our report, that 80% is not an homogeneous population. And once again, if you are either off-duty sick multiple times, or if you return to work but not in your regular duties, but rather in an administrative capacity or restricted capacity, you're not serving the way you had trained to do, and it has an impact, obviously, on your self-perception as well as on your career. Number two, if you turn to the next page, 14, and you take a look at the exhibit that we have, Exhibit 4.1, with respect to the respondents for the survey, their position was that we should have also included those who agreed with the responses. Our position was that if you take 100% and you look at the percentages there, you will have the other calculation.
Okay, very interesting, and I'm sure we're going to be delving into this much more. Would you consider this as part of the general am I done?
We can come back to you, but
okay,
we'll just try to move along to Mr. Generou, please.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. So just going back, if you may, I won't take the full 5 minutes here either, Mr. Chair, but just going back to some of the line of questioning that we talked about earlier with the temporary foreign worker program, looking at your about the audit page in Report 5, page 21, where it talks about the scope and approach. The first aspect of scope and the approach, you say that you interviewed officials at the department headquarters and regional services in Vancouver, British Columbia, Toronto, Ontario, and St. John's, New Brunswick. And then the second aspect, you conducted work in regional centers in Vancouver, Toronto, and St. John's again. I guess I'm looking for something here. We've had a real concern about the temporary foreign worker program, particularly in Alberta, and the lack of that regional approach that it has had over the years. Curious if you can point me to somewhere that you looked outside of those three centers. Again, the type of temporary foreign worker concerns that would impact an area such as St. John's, New Brunswick, versus a location like an Edmonton or a Calgary or a Fort McMurray, Alberta, would I think be vastly different. Perhaps these officials could comment on the Alberta specific unemployment rate or the temporary foreign worker program. But again, just looking for your assistance to kind of point to something there that we considered Alberta.
What we did was we looked at the program overall, and I think we do talk in the audit about some of the issues in the West related to the hospitality industry and that sort of thing. But again, most of the problems that we found tended to be in the areas of caregivers, which could be anywhere in the country, or the fish plant workers. And the issue of the fish plant workers tended to be more on the East Coast rather than on the West Coast. There were some fish plants on the West Coast that were hiring temporary foreign workers, but on the East Coast it was more prevalent. We don't have more detail going down to very specific individual provinces and things, but I think that's the type of information that when you do bring the department in to talk about this program and how they are doing the analysis, I think that having the department explain exactly how they do assess things from a regional basis, I think they will be much better positioned to be able to give you that type of information.
Thank you.
Mr. Generou, we'll now move to Ms. Mendez, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Auditor General, I would like to validate something with you. I'll read something that you wrote. It's not really a question, but an observation. Earlier, my colleague, Mr. Criverson, was talking about your message at the beginning of the report. Where you asked us to help you, and I would like to put on record that in addition to saying that you had a hard time obtaining information from the finance department and from the environment, you also said that we had opportunity to discuss this on several occasions with the Privy Council office, and you think this is a good initial measure to decide how the government will deal with our right to access to information in future audits. And then you ask us later for the House of Commons to support us when we work with the Privy Council to find a permanent solution to this problem. And that's where I think
we have half an hour bells, and so we would need unanimous consent for us to continue with this. At least, the trip to the next place isn't as long a travel period, so at least until 5:30 or 25 to. So unanimous consent, we have that. Please continue. Sorry for interrupting.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So I think here's where you request the support of the House of Commons in its discussions and its work with the Privy Council office. On our behalf, on this side of the table of the committee, we will support you in this work. You can count on us absolutely to support you in this. And I think it's in everyone's interest for this to work well, for that future audits will no longer have to have the same obstacles to get the information that is necessary. So I just want to reassure you that we'll be supporting you in these efforts, and we'll work voluntarily with you.
Yes, and I think Madam Shanahan had a little question as well.
Wanted to go.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, she can go.
Ms. Shanahan.
Okay, well, actually, if we could have just a little bit of commentary on the financial commentary, why you felt, Mr. Ferguson, it was important to have this kind of commentary, and what kind of information in the commentary itself is relevant to this committee. Do you see that we should be studying this further?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So yes, we have provided this commentary on the financial audits that we do, the work we do on financial audits. Again, as I said in my opening statement, it's about 50% of the work that we do is spent on doing financial statement audits. What we are trying to do is find a way to help you as members of Parliament, members of this committee, to navigate the type of financial information that exists and to try to understand, sort of everything that, or a lot of the information that is contained in those financial statements. So, we have done this in a way that we hope provides, some insight, but we will need your feedback on the type of information that is important to you. So, we talk about things like the impact of discount rate sensitivity on results, right? And I think it's important for members to understand that a set of financial statements is not always the numbers are not always precise. Many numbers are based on estimates, and things like pension liabilities and pension expense are one of those things that are based on estimates, and the result that you get once you have estimated, you've assumed a certain discount rate, a certain interest rate, the result that you can get can be very different. So understanding the impact of that, the sensitivity of results to those types of estimates is important. So looking at a set of financial statements and understanding how much of a set of financial statements is based on estimates and how much of it is based on hard dollar transactions, that type of thing I think is important to members. So this is our attempt to try to give you a bit more information about the financial statements of various Crown corporations, and we hope to work with you over in the future to try and understand the type of information that would be useful to you as members, to help you understand the information that are in the financial statements of the Government of Canada and in the Crown corporations.
Thank you, Ms. Shanahan. Mr. Chen, did you have a question? Yes.
I do. Thank you very much. First, let me just start off by thanking the Auditor General and his team for a diligent set of 7 reports, 3 special examinations, and the commentary that came out. I want to focus on report number 3. It jumped out at me because one of the biggest issues that we deal with in the constituency office is immigration casework. And I've had constituents come and suggest and ask the question, well, what if? Does this happen in terms of fairness and the possibility of fraud and corruption? So I read this report with a lot of interest, and I want to frame it in this way. The AG could have came and said that department officials and staff that are hired in local offices are corrupt. I don't believe he said that. He could have said they can be corrupted, and that is what he did say. Ideally, one day, I hope that the AG will come to this table or to a parliamentary committee and be able to say that it's bulletproof, that there cannot be any corruption. But we need to get there, and we need to get there, it sounds like, from the report, by implementing controls, by making sure those controls are monitored. I give the analogy of a bank. If you don't lock up the vault at the end of the night and disable the security cameras, someone's going to bound to take up the opportunity and take the money and run. And to me, that's the gist of this report, is that we've got to make sure that those controls are in place. I want to hone in on something that the Auditor General said, which is that he found no evidence that the improper actions observed during the audit were due to corruption. Can he give some examples of what those improper actions are, and whether or not those actions can be specifically attributed to other causes, or there were no specific causes that those actions could be attributed to?
Thank you, Mr. Chen. Ferguson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And certainly the problems that we found in the course of this audit could have just been the case of people not doing what they were supposed to do, or there could be other reasons for why the controls were not followed. Fundamentally, our message is that the department needs to make sure that these controls are followed, and that's not just to make sure that only people and goods can come into the country that should come into the country, but it's also to make sure that they have an environment that protects their their border service officers or the folks that work in the missions, those types of things, right? So the controls are important not just to make sure the rules are followed, but also to protect the people who are on the front line making these decisions. The type of problems we found, for example, was, as I mentioned earlier on, 300,000 vehicles that entered into Canada without the border service officers collecting the information they should have collected about who was actually in those vehicles. So they know those vehicles came into the country, they've got the license plates recorded, but they didn't collect the information about who was in them, so that was a problem.
Examples on the immigration side?
On the immigration side, I'll ask Mr. Swales to provide the details.
The clearest example is in paragraph 86, where we talk about situations where staff were looking up their own records. And in that case, as with, and we mention in paragraph 37, that the scenarios we examined were ones where there had been previous code of conduct violation situations. So again, there was a case in 2016 investigated by the Department of Staff looking up records they should not have been looking at.
So in that case, it sounds like it's not a matter of not implementing the controls. It sounds like the controls were never there. If the system is designed so that an individual can look themselves up, to me, there's no control.
Carry on, Mr. Swales. Or Mr. Ferguson.
Right. So certainly, you're right that there could be additional controls in place, but we were able to identify, for example, that those locally engaged staff were looking up their own information. So the ability did exist. The control in place was that they were not supposed to do it. They should have gone further and they should have done the analysis themselves of the information they already had. They could then go and perhaps, and even an additional step, which would be to try to build in electronic controls in the system. That would be another way. So there are different levels of controls, and they didn't have all of them, but they should have been able to identify that these types of situations were happening because, as Mr. Swales said, they already knew in the past that these situations had happened, so they should have drawn on that to look at their database to identify when those types of situations might be happening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chen. Mr. Harvey?
Quickly.
And then Mr. Christopherson.
You had mentioned, following up on Mr. Generou's comments earlier, you had mentioned that industry was not part of your audit. Speaking with industry was not part of your audit when you conducted it around the temporary foreign worker program, and I was just wondering if you could elaborate on the reason why.
So I have had it confirmed that we didn't meet with any of the employers. I'd have to sort of go back into the, sort of all of the decisions about, what we were going to do in the course of that audit. So I don't have the answer for you right now, but we'll go back and we can get you an answer for that.
Okay. And then I just wanted to touch really quick on the relevance of data, and data is something we talk a lot about in this committee, and a lack of data across a lot of departments. And if you go to page 11 in the report, it says the department also noted that unemployment in any given area does not necessarily mean that there are Canadians or permanent residents available to fill those job vacancies. And the reason for that is directly linked to data. Because just because the data indicates one thing doesn't necessarily relay to the relevance. So I'm going to give an example. The transportation industry. So there was a CTA study that was done recently that identified that by 2024 there could be as many as 48,000 job vacancies in the transportation industry in Canada by 2024. And if you looked at the relevant data in New Brunswick, the relevant data would say, in my riding, there's 350 transportation companies in Tobic-Mactaquac, and the data would say that there's a surplus of truck drivers there. Yet companies are utilizing the temporary foreign worker program to fill those vacancies because they can't get enough drivers to fill those spots. But they're really using it as a pathway to citizenship. And sometimes this program is being used for an alternative use because there's not an available immigration tool to fill the void that's there. And I'll give you an example of how the data can be skewed. Is when they look at data of drivers who are ready, willing, and able to go fill those job vacancies, I would show up as somebody that's available to drive a truck because I'm not working for a trucking company and I hold a Class 1 driver's license. But obviously today, I'm not ready, willing, and able to go to work in that industry. So I'm wondering if you feel that, the industry, just when you elaborate on the reasons why industry was not included in this, if you could maybe give us a few comments on what your opinion is around the relevance of industry data to cross against the data from the department. I think it would be interesting to see how much space there is between what the department says versus what industry is saying.
So I think I certainly can comment already that we feel, the need to collect the data is important. I think, we did identify that they weren't using, some bits of the data they already had, including the record of employment and the employment insurance data. But then also, as I pointed out earlier, they have been working with Statistics Canada to put together a new survey of information. So, what will be interesting, I suppose, to hear from the department is what type of analysis of that data will allow them to do, whether what they will get out of that survey will help them to better understand what the situation is in terms of available workers. For example, the types of situations that you're describing. Will that information help them better identify when there are vacancies and when there are people available to work? I think that's something that would be useful to find out from the department in the course of your conversation with them.
Perfect. Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Harvey. Mr. Christofferson.
Thank you, Chair. If I can be permitted by you, a very brief statement, just an observation, but I think an important one. This committee, unlike any other committee, absolutely fails to function, in my opinion, when we're partisan. And I think most members have been on this committee long enough now and have had enough broad exposure that they would agree that the hard part of this job is to stay away from the partisanship and try to stay with the facts and the analysis and good governance. It's been fairly easy for the government members so far because all the reports we've been getting were the previous government. The proof in the pudding is always when it starts to be an analysis of their own government, and that's where it gets difficult. And I just wanted to say that I have all along felt, and this is my 5th parliament in terms of being on this committee, this is by far the best committee in terms of working as a team, and I just wanted to point to, underscore, and thank the government members who have made it very clear that on the first time there was a little bit of push between the work that we have to do here and their allegiance to their government, that the partisan part of it, that through Madame Mendez making it very clear that they stand foursquare behind us, where we all stand foursquare behind you, Auditor General, to ensure that the legislation that says that you get access to the information that you want is backed up by us. It couldn't happen with just the Conservatives and myself. It had to include the government members. And Chair, in addition to the great job that you're doing, I just wanted to thank the government members and point out to them, because it's going to get tougher. It's going to get tougher. And for those of us that know how tough it is, every now and then we need to be giving you that credibility, because it's a great service to Canadians you give. And believe me, there's going to be times when you're going to piss off people in leadership in your party, and you're going to feel that pressure. And yet to be here consistently and say, no, if it's the Auditor General work, that's my priority when I'm on this committee, and the oversight that we do is the priority. That deserves to be congratulated, underscored, and even celebrated, and it comes best from those of us that are in the opposition benches. So I just want to say to my colleagues, thank you for living up to the commitment that you've made, and you continue to make this the best Public Accounts Committee that I've had the honor to serve on. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Christofferson. And I just want to sum up. Yeah, yeah, you're very, very kind and very generous. But I would wholeheartedly agree with what Mr. Christofferson says. Our role here is to make government better. And for the Canadians that are watching this today, what you've seen happen is this week, our Auditor General, first of all, has come to Parliament and in an in-camera meeting provided his documentation of the spring 2017 report in camera, and we have been briefed a little bit there in camera. He then tabled the report. It becomes public for Canadians. The next part of that exercise, after he goes through explaining to media, is is the explanation of each one of these chapters, each one of these reports. Today, he has come to our committee to give us a synopsis of what's in here. We've had a very quick little opportunity today to quiz, to question not only our Auditor General, but his team, because our job now is to call in departments that he has found perhaps in some ways lacking some areas. They could do certain things better, collection of data, other things. And so now we will bring them in. We look at his recommendations, we look at our Auditor General's report, and we hear from them. Then, so the Canadians understand this, we then draw up a report with recommendations of those departments. And this is to help government, the government in power today, that when they make a policy, they expect departments will deliver on that policy. And sometimes it moves very freely and there's no problems. Other times it's more difficult. And so it's a very important responsibility to all members here that we do our work and that we bring these departments and hold them to account so that whatever policy governments expect, departments deliver. And so we thank you today for being here and helping us as we prepare to call these departments before committee and to hear from them. So thank you very much. We are adjourned.